So last night, a familiar face returned to the campaign. Boris Johnson is back.
The former Prime Minister, who's been missing from much of the election, returned for his first rally last night.
He was surrounded by excited supporters as he attacked Nigel Farage and Reform and urged voters to block a Labour supermajority.
Earlier, we spoke with Conservative Minister Mel Stride, who had this prediction about how his own party will fare tomorrow.
It's also, I think, about how Parliament is going to operate and whether we're going to have an effective opposition or not, because if you look at the polls, it's pretty clear that Labour at this stage are heading for an extraordinary landslide on a scale that has probably never, ever been seen in this country before.
So let's start assessing all of that. What happened yesterday? Joining us now, political commentator Theo Usherwood. Good to see you, Theo.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
What do you make of the Boris factor?
I think it's just clear that Boris Johnson has that pizzazz, if you like, that Rishi Sunak hasn't had. And it's always a very stark contrast when you put Boris Johnson against other politicians when it comes to campaigning, how well he compares. It was also noticeable that Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson didn't really share the stage. There was no moment when they were together. It wasn't like Rishi Sunak saying, here's my friend Boris Johnson, because there is still quite a lot of animosity between the two, particularly from Boris Johnson's side of things, because he always felt that he was stabbed in the back by Rishi Sunak, who, of course, was Chancellor and wanted the top job, his top job, and took it from him over Partygate.
So why would he do it? Why would he come back then?
I think he's come back for the party. The Tories are in real trouble now. You heard there from Mel Stride, the Work and Pensions Secretary. He's facing losing his seat. Most of the Cabinet will lose their seats. There are only a couple that will keep their seats. And it's now looking and conceding defeat in that interview that he did with you earlier, that the Tories are going to be absolutely hammered in this election. It's just a question of how bad are the losses. And I think Boris Johnson does have some loyalty towards the Conservative Party. He is a Conservative. He's been a lifelong Conservative member, and I think what he's trying to stop is a catastrophic event, an existential event for the Conservative Party, and that's why he's lending his support. But it's very clear that he's not here to support Rishi Sunak. It's very clear that when it comes to campaigning, they were chanting his name last night at the National Army Museum. They're saying, Boris, Boris, Boris. He still has that love from the Conservative Party, and he has that pulling power that Rishi Sunak doesn't have.
But on that note, there's been 6 weeks without Boris. If he's got that star power, if he's got that pizzazz that you described, where has he been for the last 6 weeks?
I think he I know this from earlier on in the campaign. He just felt like, he had the mandate from 2019. He promised to get Brexit done. He promised 40 new hospitals, the 20,000 police officers. That was his mandate. People voted for it, they gave him an 80-seat majority, and the Conservative Party decided to go in a different direction. And it's not up to him to come back and save the Conservative Party now. I think that what's changed is the fact the Conservative Party is facing oblivion. I think there's also a feeling that voters tend to tune in at the very last moment, and there might be something more that he can offer with 24 hours, 36 hours to go, than if he was to come back earlier on.
You talk about him coming back in terms of argument, but what about coming back physically? Could you see him returning to the Conservative Party, in the hierarchy?
No. He owns too much money doing those after-dinner speaking. The most thankless job, the hardest job in Parliament is being Leader of the Opposition. And he's not going to come back to be an MP or sit on a shadow front bench. So if he was to come back, he would lead the Conservative Party, and it is hard work. It is a slog, and Boris doesn't have the focus to do it. He doesn't have the will to do it, and he's living his best life now, having been a Prime Minister. He'd only come back to be Prime Minister, and he's not going to be able to be Prime Minister. That's clear. That's obviously not going to happen.
What about 2028, 2029? The next general election?
I think the Conservative Party is going to go in a different direction. I think they're going to look to others. The question, of course, is we're not really going to be able to answer that question until we know who keeps their seat. But I think you're looking to people like Kemi Badenoch, potentially to take the party on after the election. It just depends on the scale of the defeat and also how it pans out in the election as to who comes back to Parliament. And I think also there's a question mark over what does the Conservative Party do about Nigel Farage? Do they try and form some sort of alliance with Reform in the House of Commons? Has that now, the prospect of that now disappeared because of Nigel Farage's comments about Vladimir Putin during the campaign? Or actually is there some sort of agreement that can be formed where Reform and the Conservative Party can work together to take on Labour post the election. And ultimately, I think there might also be a question, but I think this is some way away, about whether Nigel Farage has to come into the Conservative Party to save it eventually.
It is fascinating what people pick up on as a fault and whatever. What Farage said about Putin or the West's intentions towards the East were not wrong. They were factually correct. And yet they've been interpreted. People look at the Ukraine and they think, well, we're not listening to why Ukraine happened and why this conflict happened. Just the fact is, he seems to have said something positive about Putin, therefore we're against him.
I think the problem, I take a more neutral point of view, but I think the problem for Nigel Farage is how it sets himself up against the Conservative Party. And I think strategically, if right-wing politics is going to come back into play in this country after this election, because you're going to have a strong Liberal Democrats, if you're looking at the polls, Labour is going to have a very large majority. The right-wing politics in this country, whoever makes it up, they're going to have to work together. Otherwise, if they're constantly fighting, they're going to have to work together. And I just think that the comments about Vladimir Putin put a dividing line into that framework, if you like, of how the politicians on the right of the country work together, because there is a divide about it. The Conservative Party under Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, have taken a very strong line against Vladimir Putin. They have not gone down the route of saying, well, we need to find some sort of deal with Vladimir Putin if it involves Russia carving off part of Ukraine. And I think strategically, it almost shot himself in the foot for conversations that need to be had after the election about how Nigel Farage and the Conservative Party cohabit the right of British politics.
Well, Boris Johnson calling Nigel Farage last night a Kremlin crawler and the Reform Party Putinistas. Do you think there'll be questions, Theo, next week about our electoral system? Obviously, depending on how well Reform perform tomorrow, but this Survation poll that came out last night said they're likely to be the third most voted for party, but are only going to get a handful of seats.
I think it's not in the interest of the Conservative Party, and it's not in the interest of the Labour Party to change the system. And of course, they're going to, and it would require legislation in the House of Commons. But if you look at, depending on how Reform poll in this election, then it may well be the case that if you were to change the system to proportional representation, where you divvy up the seats according to the vote share after any election, they can end up with 100+ seats. And that completely changes the game. And that is not in the interest of Keir Starmer, and it is certainly not in the interest of the Conservative Party.
OK, Theo, thank you very much indeed. Theo Usherwood is a political commentator. Thank you very much. And nothing's going to happen that's going to derail Labour. The lead's too big, isn't it?
I think the lead is too big, but I think there are real questions as to what happens, how big the lead is. What is the Conservative Party reduced to? I say this impartially. Good governments happen when there is a decent opposition. If you have a very weak opposition and governments feel that they can do what they want, then you can easily end up in a situation where you end up with bad laws that don't help anybody, because the executive, in this case number 10, can simply go, we want this, and there's no proper scrutiny. So I do think there is an argument to be made, just from a neutral's point of view, that actually it is helpful, it is good for the country to have a decent opposition in place to hold the executive, and this happens in the House of Commons, by the way, to account, to hold Keir Starmer to account. And that's how you end up with better laws that help more people and make this country a better place to live. And I think if you have a weak opposition, I think that is problematic, and I think there's something to be cautious about.
Theo Usherwood, thank you very much indeed for your analysis.
Thank you.